I'll now take us on to Dr. Roisín A. Costello, who will be talking about smart borders and vulnerable subjects. So Roisín is an assistant professor in the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University. A graduate of the LLB at Trinity College Dublin, Roisín also holds master's degrees from the Institut d'études politiques de Paris and Georgetown Law. Roisín completed her PhD in law at Trinity College Dublin, where her doctoral research was funded by the Irish Research Council. So thank you so much, Roisín. Just, take it away whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Alicia. So I'm going to just share my screen. Hopefully it works. I should be used to this when teaching, but I'm still not. Okay, great. So there we go. So I'm going to be speaking about, as Alicia said, smart borders and vulnerable subjects. I suppose I should qualify this by saying the pandemic has deprived us of a lot of things. One of them is the opportunity to panic and prepare your presentation on a plane or a train. So maybe a little bit less polished than it would be in non-pandemic times, but hopefully we'll get through it. So I'm going to start with a quote from Larry Siddentop's book, Inventing the Individual. He's speaking, and I'm not a classicist, so I can't speak to the accuracy of this, certainly in historical terms, but he's speaking about the, I suppose, religious grounding of individualism and the construction of citizenship in particular. And there's a quote in which he says, only speaking about women who are being, I suppose, passed from one family to another and their departure from their, I suppose, constructed family around kind of ancestor worship and their passage into a new family with their husband. And he says, only when she'd been received into the worship of her new family in another solemn ceremony before the sacred fire did she acquire a new identity, an identity that enabled her to enter and leave the house of her own accord. Now, once again, she had ancestors and a future. And when we're speaking about identity and specifically around borders and thresholds, I think that's actually a really interesting place to start thinking about how we establish thresholds for having rights, and then what our rights are in those threshold spaces as well. In modern international law and in the constitutional schema, we also have this idea to gain the protection of a state, you have to pass away from the state you were in to accede to these new protections and guarantees. And in doing so, abandon the kind of person you constructed yourself as previously in another culture and another jurisdiction and accede to the cultures and the norms of this jurisdiction you're trying to pass into. So there's that kind of threshold that you have to pass over, that you have to move from one idea of yourself into another idea of yourself as a citizen and an individual. But in doing so, it's not merely kind of, I suppose, a voluntary passage over the threshold. In this, just before this quote, Siddentop talks about women actually being physically carried over the threshold, because until they are recognised in this second ceremony, they physically had no existence as an individual. And we need to think about, I think, citizenship at borders in a similar way. There's not only the idea that you have to pass over the threshold, but also that there are thresholds you need to, I suppose, satisfy or overcome in order to do that in a legal sense as well as a physical sense. So this is sometimes referred to as the right to have rights. So you have to establish yourself as worthy of citizenship as well as passing over this physical boundary. And I suppose when we think about that in law, we tend to think about it in very legalistic terms. And I think Sahara's presentation does that very well, where we talk about, international law establishes very clear boundaries for who can and cannot pass over those thresholds and what they have to show in terms of persecution or some other characteristic in order for them to be recognised when they do. Because otherwise they're not an asylum seeker, they're not a refugee, they're not a citizen, and they simply don't exist within our legal schema and are returned to their context of origin. So in thinking about that, I think you see, I think very vividly how some of the themes that underline that historical context Siddentop is talking about continue to reverberate through our own kind of legal context at the moment. And you see, I think, very clearly how idealist and materialist understandings of rights and citizenship can collide. We're not only talking about the materialistic things or thresholds or contexts you have to exist in to claim citizenship and be seen as a citizen. We're also talking about the idealistic thresholds you have to cross over. How do you constitute yourself as a citizen in a new jurisdiction, but also in a new normative framework when we think of citizenship in Western Europe, we conceptualize it in a very specific way. And certainly within a European Union context, we also conceptualize it in a really specific way, that you undertake obligations, that you have burdens in exchange for your rights, and those are held in a very individualistic way, and that your relationship as an individualistic citizen who is constructed under that schema is held in tension with the state, in which you both continually have to satisfy thresholds in order to maintain the status quo of that relationship, state and protected citizen. So I suppose that's the starting point and maybe the frame for this research. What I'm particularly interested in, and where I suppose that kind of thinking about citizenship and what qualifies you as a citizen kind of intersects with my other, I suppose, maybe more pragmatic area of research, which is technology law, is around smart borders and how we've begun to layer additional thresholds onto the traditionally physical thresholds of border spaces in law. So I suppose the first thing to answer is what are smart border policies or smart borders themselves? So I suppose we're all kind of accustomed to, maybe particularly on this island, with thinking about borders as watchtowers or police checkpoints and the physical architectures of borders. What smart borders and smart border policies do is, in situations where increasingly constitutional democracies are uncomfortable with that physical manifestation of highly policed borders, except maybe in the United States, which we'll talk about in a moment, they've replaced it and sometimes augmented it by adding it to an existing structure with smart borders. So the idea that in border areas there is consistent surveillance through CCTV or the use of drone footage, that normal kind of everyday things like going to an ATM or exposing yourself to CCTV, normal, in a town structure perhaps, that there's facial recognition incorporated into that kind of what we would now consider quotidian surveillance, but which is itself obviously somewhat problematic. But that there's also things like behavioural monitoring through artificial intelligence, which uses kind of, I suppose, body language cues and unmanned surveillance vehicles to monitor the way in which people's behaviour and body language indicates or does not indicate a particular intent. And those, I suppose, smart border policies, maybe from that description, you've already kind of thought they're quite invasive. They do, I suppose, expose individual communities moving through border spaces to an intensified level of surveillance, and a level of surveillance which is not extant in other communities who are not at the border, but also is not deemed acceptable in communities which are not in border spaces. It's motivated, I suppose, increasingly in the two areas I look at in this paper, by an increasingly intense rhetoric about immigration, the permissibilities of integration, and the kind of potential and need to police zones of immigration and external borders. So the two examples I look at in the paper are the European Union's Mediterranean border, which is, I suppose, poorly defined, but we can broadly draw as down the border in the Eastern European member states and through the Mediterranean Sea around Sicily and the Greek islands. And then the second example is the US-Mexico border, also in the southern part of that jurisdiction. Both of the borders, I suppose, although obviously quite different in terms of the legal and social context they operate in, have certain shared characteristics that I think make the comparison quite appropriate. They both have land and sea portions, so they're both, I suppose, borders that have fairly complex needs in terms of policing or monitoring, as perceived by the jurisdictions doing that policing and monitoring. But there are also technologies and borders which are deployed across constitutive jurisdictions. So within the EU, for example, they're deployed across the individual member states who have responsibility for policing their individual borders. And within the US context, obviously, within a federal scheme, they're deployed across constitutive jurisdictions along the southern border, less than in the EU, obviously, in that there are less states, but nonetheless the same basic geographic architecture for how those borders are constructed and who is responsible for policing them. So I suppose when we talk about the Mexico-US border, and we'll start here, I sort of presume people are even passingly familiar with it, and perhaps individuals in the audience are more familiar with it than I am, maybe. The US-Mexico border is perhaps I suppose, leading comparator in maybe a negative way of a militarized and physical infrastructure which continues to endure. So in an international context in which borders, with some kind of fairly notable examples, and we think about Pakistan and India, obviously, so hard we have to talk about that, highly militarized and contested border. But within an international context where borders have increasingly adopted the approach that physical infrastructure is no longer needed, or minimal physical infrastructure is needed, the US-Mexico border is perhaps an outstanding example of a highly militarized and physical infrastructure, which is there not because of a contested geopolitical space or claim, but rather specifically to police immigrant experiences and immigrant accessibility to other geographies. The border has been progressively augmented in addition to those kind of physical infrastructures since 2006 with technological measures, so smart border policies. The first one of those is the Security Border Initiative Network, which essentially creates what it refers to as a virtual border wall, where they use monitoring through a system which works somewhat like radar and charting through drones and other kind of geospatial mapping to monitor the border in real time or near to real time, in addition to the physical geographies of a very highly policed border, which includes physical obstructions to crossing over, as well as kind of naturally occurring geographic features like the Rio Grande and other rivers and topologies, which I'll speak about a little bit later on. So they've created that kind of virtual border wall, but they've done so, and I think this is kind of very important, specifically if we look at a EU context in a moment, through not only state action, but also the cooperation of private actors. So it's not merely now, when we speak about smart borders, that the state is layering on technological means on top of physical means to secure, do what it thinks of as securing an external border, but it's also enlisting the help of private actors. So I suppose the very famous example of this, and the one which came to kind of popular attention, was the cooperation between Amazon and the immigration enforcement divisions of the US federal government, where Amazon had developed facial recognition software, which was being used by ICE to identify individuals who had crossed over into border territories and return them across the physical border, not even to their jurisdiction of origin, but simply not to American territory. Also, we have what are kind of referred to sometimes as dark web technologies, or identity linking, where individuals are traced through individuals they know who are citizens of the jurisdiction, in particular through social media networks, to trace maps of individuals, and in doing so locate within, I suppose, social networks, small webs of individuals who are not entitled to be in certain jurisdictions because they are not citizens. And in that, obviously, again, we get the cooperation of kind of private actors. So what we see really in the US example is, I suppose, a very good or sort of prime example of smart border technologies being layered on top of physical infrastructures, but also a change in the social idea of who polices borders, that it is not only states, but it is also private actors who are effectively themselves citizens who are policing these spaces and deeming who can and cannot be a citizen. The European Union's Mediterranean border has obviously attracted a lot of attention from a humanitarian perspective and in the context of human rights and human dignity, because of the significant risk to life and loss of life which has accompanied passage over that border, specifically across the sea border, and with somewhat less attention across the land border, which is also a very dangerous crossing and no less risky in some respects. But it isn't acknowledged, I think, as being perhaps as heavily characterized by populist rhetoric or as highly policed in a kind of semi-military way as the US border or US southern border, not really the northern border, which they're not really concerned about at all, other than road crossings. But actually, when we look at the EU's legislative package and how they're talking about moving towards a new way of policing the Mediterranean border, there's significant cause for concern, and to see a similar pattern to what exists in the US developing much closer to home, and in a context where it's, I would argue, actually legally impermissible in the context of both the European Charter of Fundamental Rights and the European Convention on Human Rights, which impose far higher standards for both state and private actor activity in terms of surveillance and ensuring human dignity and human life. So the first kind of initiative that the EU are somewhat underway but proposing to intensify in the coming years is the Row Border Initiative, which sounds quite, I suppose, speculative in some ways, in that it proposes to use unmanned aerial, water surface and underwater, as well as ground mobile vehicles. So what they're essentially talking about is not only flying drones, but vehicles which are self-driving, which are effectively drones, which would police not only the land border, ground mobile vehicles, but also surface water. So there would be unmanned small vessels, essentially both on the surface and underwater, which would also effectively man the sea border of the European Union. Crucially, it's not clear to any extent that what extent of any of those would be humanitarian vehicles or would have any kind of humanitarian function, rather than simply a deterrent and policing function in terms of flagging where ships needed to be turned back or where they were, so they could be turned back. That's been then, I suppose, joined by an October 2018 proposal for the Border Control Project, which is kind of an acronym which suggests it might have been the subject of an academic funding bid, which kind of recommends an automated border control system which would augment the row border system along the Hungarian, Greek and Latvian external borders, and specifically recommends the use of affect recognition by artificial intelligence tools to read body language cues. So this would be used in addition to kind of very, I suppose, accepted border policing mechanisms like simply border control agents in airports, ports and land crossings. So in addition to an individual asking you questions or asking you why you were passing into the EU, you would also have affect recognition. It effectively works like facial recognition in that it uses video, which has been layered with an AI, I suppose, algorithm to read what it interprets as suspicious body language. Now that's obviously, we won't go into it, but obviously incredibly problematic, not only because it brings into play the biases of the individual who developed the algorithm, but also because it's been demonstrated specifically in the US through things like the perpetual lineup report in Georgetown, which I was kind of involved in when I was there, that those kind of AI systems which are programmed to recognize certain physical characteristics or emotional cues don't work and are specifically racialized. So they will by design tend to flag individuals who are not white, who are not European, who are not speaking particular languages or not from particular expressive cultures as being suspicious or having suspicious body language. So a huge kind of range of things of concern in an EU context as well. And I think an example of how we're continuing to layer threshold requirements on the border without thinking about who should be allowed to pass through those borders. So the wall, both I suppose in legal and physical terms, continues to get higher, but the thinking about who is allowed to pass through those spaces and the need to create a space in which individuals who are citizens, both of the incoming territory and the territory they are seeking to enter, are treated as full citizens rather than having their status, I suppose, sublimated to those concerns of policing and exclusion. So I say here, what we're looking at really is this conceptual shift for, and my concern, obviously, I have a concern, obviously, on the humanitarian aspect and immigrant and refugee communities, but there's also a really specific concern for those who are permanently resident on the border, whether that's in the US or Mexico, or whether it's in the EU or the bordering territories, which are non-member states. And there's a conceptual shift for the individuals who are resident around those borders, who are essentially forced to exist in a space which, while it's geographically part of the jurisdiction they're citizens of, is also now not only geographically liminal as border areas tend to be, but also legally marginalised. So it's a space within which normal constitutional standards and normative standards are modified with more ease and far less opposition. So the justification being, or as I'm sure one of our hub colleagues would tell me, the pretext being that in liminal spaces, there are these concerns about protection of citizen rights, exclusion of the undeserving non-citizen, and that those kind of justifications are used actually to reduce the rights of those already resident and change the kind of citizenship individuals who reside around the border have, quite apart from the idea that they may be excluding individuals from citizenship without any kind of justification. So my concern, obviously, I'm primarily a privacy lawyer, and my concern largely focuses on ideas of privacy and dignity when we look at it from this kind of, I suppose, internal facing out perspective. The point of view of the external facing in perspective is obviously humanitarian and a concern about rights to life and rights to asylum. But if we look at it from the point of view of border communities for a moment, we speak a lot, certainly in the European Union, about surveilled citizens and the kind of dangers of persistent monitoring through the technologies we encounter every day. So social media, things like Zoom, where you're recorded, all those kind of technologies can gradually accumulate to create a circumstance in which individuals effectively self-police their behaviour and identities so that they are seen as conforming and non-threatening to status quos. And there's huge amounts of concern about how that affects individual autonomy and dignity very fundamentally, and how we develop as individuals in those kind of contexts. But there's been less examination about the particular I suppose, focus and concentration of those impacts on border communities who are, through those kind of smart border policies, increasingly required to live in geographic and legal zones, which are subject to much more intense surveillance on a consistent basis, in a way which serves neither the individuals trying to enter the jurisdiction nor the communities already resident within it. So what effectively we have, and if we think about kind of borders in Greece, Sicily, but also land borders in the Eastern European member states, are geographies of deterrence and restriction, where migration becomes, and restricting immigration becomes, the only concern, and the geography within which citizens live restricts around them as a result, effectively curtailing the rights they should have as citizens in the name of excluding other individuals from citizenship. I suppose there's a conceptual concern there, obviously, with rights and how your rights are affected and who has their rights vindicated. And I think it's probably important to flag, although it's been flagged a lot in kind of debate recently online, that even if a very small group of individuals in a small area of the border are experiencing those rights impacts, they are still human rights breaches. So only one individual needs to have their human rights breached for it to be a human rights breach. It doesn't, and Sahar has kind of touched on this, you don't need to have a collective breach or a collective impact for it to be a human rights concern, and that's really important from the humanitarian perspective of immigrant communities as well. But there's also, apart from that kind of conceptual concern with borders and how we police citizenship and how citizenship is changed for people who live at borders, there's also a really fundamental concern with how the geography actually physically changes as well. So there's a paper there. So Chambers and Boyce have been working on, or have worked on, this specifically in the context of the US-Mexico border, focusing on how the geographic changes that accompany greater surveillance, including greater smart surveillance, not only physical infrastructures, change patterns of movement around borders and actually force individuals around borders into less safe spaces. So they charted the paths of refugees seeking to enter the US, and found that the use of smart border technologies was actually forcing potential asylum seekers, potential refugees, into less and less safe geographic zones. So they were crossing, for example, much larger desert areas, crossing more mountainous terrain, and actually there was an increase in mortality. So more individuals die in border zones when we don't think about how these kind of digital technologies and physical geographies interact to effectively change the geography, not only the legal geography, but the physical geography of those areas. So I'm going to kind of very briefly finish up. I think I have one more slide yet. So the context of this is specifically important in terms of physical geography and the border, and how we think about policing it in legal terms. I suppose in a context of climate change, where political unrest and environmental change are driving increasing numbers of people specifically towards the European Union's border, but also towards the US border, and drives the conditions which cause kind of population movement. So if we think about that, we're thinking about not only the changed geographies, which become increasingly risky through the kind of legal and policy measures we put in place, but also the physical change within that geography itself. And thinking about that, I think we need to think about how we conceptualize citizenship around the border, as well as how we think about who is entitled to citizenship by crossing that threshold. But I think we also need to think about creating a zone in which that kind of liminal citizenship, where you are not quite across the border but existing within that border space, can be rendered safe. And can be rendered safe both for those already within that space and who are required to live in it because they reside at borders, and also those who are seeking to cross that border space and eventually move into, I suppose, the safer ground of full citizenship within the territory itself. So I'm very happy to answer any questions and looking forward to the discussion. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Roisín. That was such an illuminating talk. And again, yeah, I just feel like each of these is provoking so many questions. Thank you.